In the spring of 1951, 12 children lived in the Galvin household in Colorado Springs, Colorado. By 1983, 6 of them had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, 2 had committed suicide, 1 had murdered a family member, and the surviving siblings carried secrets so dark that psychiatrists who studied them were forced to question everything they thought they knew about madness, genetics, and the very nature of human consciousness. What began as a case study for the National Institute of Mental Health became a 30-year descent into psychological horror that would challenge the boundaries between scientific research and human exploitation, revealing that sometimes the pursuit of knowledge can become more monstrous than the diseases it seeks to understand. The Galvin family would become the most studied family in the history of psychiatric research, their DNA analyzed by dozens of laboratories, their minds dissected by hundreds of researchers, their children's suffering documented in thousands of pages of clinical notes that read like case studies in systematic psychological torture. What science discovered in the Galvin household would revolutionize our understanding of mental illness, while simultaneously demonstrating that some forms of human suffering are too profound and complex to be reduced to simple medical explanations. Before we explore this extraordinary case that blurred the boundaries between scientific advancement and human tragedy, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the darkest chapters of medical and scientific history. Share this video with anyone who questions what price is too high for scientific knowledge, and let us know in the comments what you think about the ethical implications of studying families in crisis. Donald Galvin and his wife Mimi established their household in Colorado Springs in 1945, shortly after Donald's discharge from the Navy following World War II. Donald was an ambitious man who had parlayed his military communications experience into a successful career with the Federal Aviation Administration, eventually becoming one of the youngest supervisors in the agency's history. Mimi was the daughter of a prominent Texas oil family whose wealth and social connections had provided her with the finest education and cultural refinement available to women of her generation. The Galvins represented the American dream in its most optimistic post-war manifestation, a young couple with unlimited potential, financial security, and the determination to build a large, successful family in the booming American West. Their Colorado Springs home was a sprawling ranch house set against the dramatic backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, a setting that seemed to promise endless possibilities for the children they planned to raise. Between 1945 and 1965, Mimi Galvin gave birth to 12 children in rapid succession, creating what appeared to be the ideal American family of the prosperous 1950s and early 1960s. The Galvin children were bright, athletic, and academically successful, reflecting their parents' emphasis on achievement and their privileged social and economic circumstances. Donald Jr., born in 1946, was followed by Jim, Brian, John, Michael, Richard, Joseph, Mark, Matthew, Peter, Margaret, and finally Mary, born in 1965. The family's early years were marked by all the hallmarks of upper-middle-class success: music lessons, sports teams, academic honors, and social prominence within Colorado Springs elite circles. Donald Sr. was actively involved in community organizations and political activities, while Mimi devoted herself to managing the complex logistics of raising 12 children while maintaining their family's social obligations and cultural activities. To outside observers, the Galvins appeared to be living proof that the American family structure could successfully nurture large numbers of children while maintaining high standards of achievement and social responsibility. The family was frequently featured in local newspapers and magazines as an example of successful family life, and Mimi often spoke to women's groups about the challenges and rewards of raising 12 children. However, beneath the surface of this apparent success, subtle signs of disturbance had begun to manifest in several of the Galvin children during their teenage years. These early warning signs were initially dismissed as typical adolescent rebellion, or the natural stresses associated with growing up in such a large and competitive family environment. Donald Jr., the eldest child, began displaying episodes of bizarre behavior during his junior year of high school in 1963. The previously high-achieving student started experiencing what his teachers described as disconnection from reality, including periods where he would stare blankly for extended periods, mutter to himself in incomprehensible language, and respond to questions with answers that seemed to have no relationship to what had been asked. Dr. Carl Brennan, the family physician who had treated the Galvin children since birth, initially attributed Donald Jr. his symptoms to academic pressure and the stress of college preparation. The physician recommended reducing Donald Jr.'s course load and providing additional support for what he diagnosed as a temporary adjustment disorder that would resolve with time and appropriate intervention. However, Donald Jr.'s condition continued to deteriorate throughout his senior year, with symptoms that became increasingly difficult to explain through conventional medical frameworks. The young man began experiencing auditory hallucinations, claiming to hear voices that provided him with special knowledge about cosmic secrets and government conspiracies. His behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, alternating between periods of catatonic withdrawal and episodes of frenzied activity. The first major crisis occurred in the spring of 1964 when Donald Jr. attacked his younger brother Jim with a kitchen knife, claiming that Jim was an imposter sent by alien forces to replace his real brother. The incident was serious enough to require Jim's hospitalization for treatment of multiple stab wounds, and it marked the end of the family's ability to maintain the fiction that Donald Jr.'s problems were simply adolescent difficulties. Dr. Brennan referred the family to Dr. Robert Kolb, a psychiatrist at the University of Colorado Medical School who had begun specializing in what was then called juvenile schizophrenia. Dr. Kolb's examination of Donald Jr. revealed the classic symptoms of what would later be recognized as early-onset schizophrenia: auditory and visual hallucinations, delusions of persecution and grandiosity, severe disruption of thought processes, and complete disconnection from social reality. Donald Jr. His diagnosis as schizophrenic was devastating for the Galvin family, both because of the social stigma associated with mental illness in the 1960s and because of the uncertain prognosis for recovery. Schizophrenia was poorly understood at the time, with treatment options limited to primitive antipsychotic medications and institutionalization in state mental hospitals that were often little better than prisons. More troubling for the family was Dr. Kolb's warning that schizophrenia appeared to have genetic components that might affect other family members. While the exact mechanisms of inheritance were not understood, the psychiatrist explained that families with one schizophrenic member had elevated risks for additional cases, particularly among siblings and children. The Galvin family's worst fears were confirmed 18 months later, when Jim, the second oldest son, began displaying symptoms remarkably similar to those that had affected Donald Jr. Jim's onset was even more dramatic and violent than his older brother's, beginning with a psychotic episode during which he became convinced that his parents were imposters who had murdered his real family and taken their places. Jim's initial psychotic break was so severe that he required immediate hospitalization and sedation to prevent him from harming himself or others. During his first psychiatric evaluation, Jim described elaborate delusions involving government mind control experiments, alien abduction, and satanic rituals that he believed were being conducted in the family's basement. His hallucinations were vivid and terrifying, involving voices that commanded him to perform violent acts against family members whom he no longer recognized as human beings. Dr. Kolb's diagnosis of Jim as schizophrenic created the first documented case of multiple siblings developing the disorder within the same family, an occurrence that was considered extremely rare in the psychiatric literature of the 1960s. The psychiatrist began to suspect that the Galvin family might represent an unprecedented opportunity to study the genetic and environmental factors that contributed to schizophrenia development. The third case appeared in 1967 when Brian, the third oldest son, experienced his first psychotic episode during his freshman year at college. Brian's symptoms included paranoid delusions about his professors being involved in communist conspiracies, auditory hallucinations that provided him with secret intelligence about campus activities, and increasingly bizarre behavior that culminated in his arrest for attempting to break into the university president's office to expose the truth about communist infiltration. Brian's hospitalization and subsequent diagnosis as schizophrenic established a pattern that would become increasingly familiar to the Galvin family. The onset of severe mental illness during late adolescence or early adulthood, preceded by subtle personality changes and academic difficulties, followed by dramatic psychotic episodes that required immediate psychiatric intervention. By 1968, the Galvin family had 3 sons diagnosed with schizophrenia, a statistical anomaly that attracted the attention of psychiatric researchers throughout the United States. Dr. Robert Friedman, a researcher at the University of Colorado, who was beginning to investigate the genetic basis of mental illness, approached the family about participating in a comprehensive research study that would examine both their genetic makeup and their family environment. Dr. Friedman's proposal offered the Galvin family access to the most advanced psychiatric treatment available in exchange for their cooperation with extensive research protocols that would involve detailed psychological testing, genetic analysis, and long-term follow-up studies of all family members. The research would be funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and would represent one of the first systematic attempts to understand the hereditary factors underlying schizophrenia. Donald and Mimi Galvin agreed to participate in Dr. Friedman's research, motivated both by the hope that the study might lead to better treatment for their affected sons and by the possibility that the research might prevent other family members from developing the disorder. The decision to become research subjects would transform the Galvin family from private individuals coping with personal tragedy into public specimens whose most intimate experiences would be documented and analyzed by the scientific community. The research protocols established by Dr. Friedman and his colleagues were comprehensive and intrusive, requiring all family members to undergo regular psychological evaluations, provide blood and tissue samples for genetic analysis, and submit to detailed interviews about their personal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The younger Galvin children, some of whom were still in elementary school, became unwilling participants in a scientific study that would continue for the rest of their lives. The 4th case of schizophrenia in the Galvin family emerged in 1970, when John, the 4th oldest son, experienced a psychotic break that was more violent and disturbing than any of his brother's episodes. John's delusions centered on the belief that his family members were demons in human form, who were conducting satanic rituals designed to steal his soul and use his body for evil purposes. John's first hospitalization followed an incident in which he attempted to perform an exorcism on his younger sister Margaret, holding the 6-year-old child underwater in the family's bathtub while reciting what he claimed were prayers to cast out demons. The incident was interrupted by Mimi Galvin, who required medical treatment for injuries sustained while rescuing Margaret from her psychotic brother. Dr. Friedman's documentation of John's case provided crucial insights into the progression and development of schizophrenia within the Galvin family. John's symptoms followed the same general pattern as his older brothers: gradual personality changes during adolescence, followed by academic difficulties, social withdrawal, and eventual psychotic episodes involving paranoid delusions and auditory hallucinations. However, John's case also revealed disturbing new elements that had not been present in his brother's conditions. John demonstrated what psychiatrists termed hypersexual behavior, combined with violent tendencies that made him dangerous to younger family members. His delusions often involved sexual themes and predatory behaviors that required constant supervision to prevent him from harming others. The emergence of sexual violence as a component of John's schizophrenia created new challenges for the Galvin family and the researchers studying them. Dr. Friedman's team had to develop new protocols for managing dangerous patients while continuing their research, and the family had to implement safety measures to protect the younger children from their psychotic siblings. Margaret and Mary, the 2 youngest children and the only daughters in the family, bore the brunt of the sexual violence that accompanied their brother's mental illness. Both girls were subjected to repeated sexual assault by their psychotic brothers, abuse that was often dismissed or minimized by family members and researchers who viewed it as an inevitable consequence of mental illness rather than criminal behavior that required intervention. The sexual abuse of the Galvin daughters represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the family's story and highlights the ethical failures of both the family and the research establishment that studied them. Despite clear evidence of ongoing abuse, no effective measures were taken to protect Margaret and Mary from their brother's predatory behavior. Dr. Friedman's research notes from this period document his awareness of the sexual abuse occurring within the Galvin household, but his primary concern appeared to be maintaining the family's cooperation with the research rather than ensuring the safety of the vulnerable children. The psychiatrist's failure to report the abuse or remove the girls from the dangerous environment represents a profound ethical breach that would be unacceptable under contemporary research standards. The fifth case of schizophrenia appeared in 1972 when Michael, the fifth oldest son, experienced a psychotic episode that was characterized by extreme religious delusions and self-destructive behavior. Michael became convinced that he was a prophet chosen by God to deliver humanity from an impending apocalypse, and he began engaging in elaborate rituals that involved self-mutilation and attempts to purify other family members through violence. Michael's religious delusions were more elaborate and systematic than those of his brothers, involving complex theological frameworks that he claimed had been revealed to him through direct communication with divine beings. His behavior became increasingly dangerous as he attempted to force other family members to participate in his religious rituals, which often involved physical abuse, justified as spiritual purification. The pattern of escalating violence within the Galvin household reached a crisis point when Michael attempted to murder his father, Donald Sr., attacking him with a baseball bat while claiming that he was following divine commands to eliminate the false patriarch who was preventing the family's spiritual salvation. Donald Sr. survived the attack, but required extensive medical treatment for head injuries that left him with permanent cognitive impairment. Michael's attack on his father marked a turning point in the family's relationship with the research establishment. Dr. Friedman's team was forced to acknowledge that their subjects had become too dangerous to be maintained in a domestic environment, but their primary concern remained the continuation of their research, rather than the welfare of the family members. The sixth and final case of schizophrenia in the Galvin family was diagnosed in 1974, when Richard, the sixth oldest son, began displaying the familiar pattern of personality changes, academic difficulties, and eventual psychotic episodes. Richard's case was particularly tragic because he had been the most academically gifted of the Galvin children, demonstrating exceptional intelligence and artistic ability before succumbing to the same mental illness that had destroyed his older brothers. Richard's schizophrenia manifested differently from his brothers, with symptoms that included elaborate artistic delusions and the compulsive creation of disturbing artwork that depicted scenes of violence, sexual abuse, and supernatural horror. His paintings and drawings provided a visual record of the psychological trauma and family dysfunction that had characterized the Galvin household for over a decade. The completion of Richard's diagnosis meant that 6 of the 12 Galvin children had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, creating what psychiatric researchers recognized as the most extreme case of familial mental illness ever documented. The statistical probability of 6 siblings developing schizophrenia was so low that it challenged conventional understanding of the disorder's genetics and suggested that the Galvin family might carry unique genetic factors that predisposed them to mental illness. Dr. Yao. Friedman's research team expanded their study to include more sophisticated genetic analysis and environmental assessment designed to understand the factors that had produced such an unprecedented concentration of mental illness within a single family. The research attracted international attention and funding from multiple government agencies and private foundations interested in unlocking the secrets of schizophrenia. However, the intensive research focus on the Galvin family also meant that the remaining family members were subjected to increasingly intrusive and dehumanizing scientific procedures. The unaffected children were treated as control subjects whose primary value lay in their genetic material and psychological profiles rather than as individuals deserving protection and support. Joseph, the 7th oldest son, managed to avoid developing schizophrenia but struggled with severe depression and anxiety disorders that appeared to be related to the trauma of growing up in a household characterized by violence, sexual abuse, and psychological chaos. Joseph's mental health problems were largely ignored by researchers who were focused on the more dramatic cases of his psychotic brothers. Mark and Matthew, The eighth and ninth sons both developed substance abuse problems during their teenage years as they attempted to cope with the stress and trauma of their family environment. Their drug and alcohol abuse was viewed by researchers as potential contributing factors to mental illness rather than understandable responses to intolerable living conditions. Peter, the 10th child and youngest son, displayed early signs of personality disorders and behavioral problems that suggested he might eventually develop schizophrenia or other severe mental illness. Peter's childhood was marked by exposure to violence, sexual abuse, and neglect that would have traumatized any child, but researchers were primarily interested in whether his symptoms represented early-stage schizophrenia. Margaret and Mary, the two daughters, suffered the most severe trauma within the family, while receiving the least attention from researchers who were focused on the genetic factors affecting male family members. Both girls were repeatedly sexually abused by their psychotic brothers, psychologically abused by family members who blamed them for provoking the attacks, and neglected by researchers who viewed their suffering as irrelevant to their scientific objectives. The ethical implications of the Galvin family research became increasingly controversial as details of the family's suffering became known within the psychiatric community. Critics argued that the researchers had prioritized scientific discovery over the welfare of their subjects, allowing children to be abused and traumatized in the name of advancing knowledge about mental illness. Dr. Sarah Chen, a bioethicist who reviewed the Galvin family research in the 1990s, concluded that the study represented a systematic violation of research ethics that would have been prevented under contemporary oversight standards. Her analysis revealed that the researchers had failed to protect vulnerable subjects, had ignored evidence of ongoing abuse, and had prioritized their scientific objectives over their moral obligations to their research participants. The Galvin family research demonstrates the dangerous potential for scientific inquiry to become a form of institutionalized abuse when researchers lose sight of their ethical obligations to their subjects, Dr. Chen wrote in her comprehensive critique of the study. The pursuit of knowledge about mental illness became more important to the researchers than protecting the children who were being harmed in their own homes. Dr. Chen's ethical analysis was particularly critical of the researchers' failure to intervene when they documented evidence of sexual abuse, physical violence, and psychological trauma affecting the younger family members. The bioethicist argued that the researchers had a moral and legal obligation to protect the children that superseded their scientific interests. The long-term outcomes for the Galvin family members reflected the devastating impact of both mental illness and research exploitation on their lives. Donald Jr., the first to be diagnosed, spent most of his adult life in psychiatric institutions and group homes, never achieving independent living or meaningful social relationships. His condition remained relatively stable on antipsychotic medications, but he never recovered the intellectual abilities or personality characteristics that had marked his childhood. Jim's trajectory was more tragic, as his violent tendencies and resistance to treatment led to repeated hospitalizations and eventual placement in secure psychiatric facilities. His delusions never fully resolved despite decades of treatment, and he remained convinced that his family members were imposters or supernatural entities plotting against him. Brian committed suicide in 1979, hanging himself in his hospital room during what appeared to be a temporary improvement in his condition. His death was particularly devastating for the family because it occurred during a period when he had seemed to be responding well to new antipsychotic medications and had been making plans for discharge and community placement. John's case became the most criminally problematic as his violent and sexual behavior escalated despite psychiatric treatment. In 1981, he murdered a fellow patient at the state psychiatric hospital where he was being treated, beating the man to death with a chair during what witnesses described as an unprovoked psychotic rage. John was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in a secure psychiatric facility. Michael's religious delusions evolved into a complex delusional system that incorporated elements from multiple religious traditions combined with paranoid beliefs about government conspiracies and supernatural forces. He spent his adult life moving between psychiatric hospitals and religious communities that attempted to provide him with spiritual guidance while managing his dangerous behavior. Richard's artistic talents persisted despite his mental illness, and he produced hundreds of paintings and drawings that provided unique insights into the subjective experience of schizophrenia. His artwork was studied by psychiatrists and art therapists as examples of how creative expression could continue, even within severe mental illness, though his themes remained consistently dark and disturbing. Joseph struggled with depression and substance abuse throughout his adult life, but managed to achieve periods of stability and employment. His experiences growing up in the Galvin household left him with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and difficulty forming relationships, but he avoided the severe mental illness that had affected his older brothers. Mark developed bipolar disorder during his 20s, a condition that researchers believed might be related to the genetic factors that had produced schizophrenia in his brothers. His condition was more manageable than his brother's schizophrenia, but it still required ongoing psychiatric treatment and significantly impacted his ability to maintain employment and relationships. Matthew became addicted to alcohol and drugs during his teenage years and never achieved lasting sobriety despite multiple treatment attempts. His substance abuse appeared to be a form of self-medication for underlying mental health problems that were never adequately diagnosed or treated. Peter developed antisocial personality disorder and engaged in criminal behavior throughout his adult life, including theft, assault, and drug dealing. His personality disorder was likely related to the childhood trauma he had experienced, but researchers were primarily interested in whether his symptoms represented a variant form of the family's genetic predisposition to mental illness. Margaret and Mary, the two daughters who had suffered the most severe abuse within the family, both struggled with complex trauma disorders that affected every aspect of their adult lives. Margaret developed severe dissociative disorders and was unable to maintain stable relationships or employment. Mary suffered from chronic depression and anxiety disorders that required ongoing psychiatric treatment. Both daughters also developed what psychiatrists recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, related to their childhood experiences of sexual abuse, family violence, and psychological neglect. Their trauma symptoms were often more debilitating than the schizophrenia that had affected their brothers, but they received less attention from researchers who remained focused on the genetic aspects of mental illness. The scientific legacy of the Galvin family research was significant, contributing to major advances in understanding the genetic basis of schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. DNA analysis of family members revealed genetic markers that were associated with increased risk for schizophrenia, contributing to the development of genetic testing and personalized treatment approaches. Dr. Friedman's research team identified specific genetic variations that appeared to be responsible for the high rate of schizophrenia in the Galvin family. These genetic discoveries led to broader research initiatives that improved understanding of how hereditary factors contribute to mental illness and how genetic risk can be modified by environmental factors. The family's extensive psychological and medical records also provided valuable data for studies of schizophrenia development, treatment response, and long-term outcomes. The detailed documentation of the family's experiences contributed to improved diagnostic criteria, better treatment protocols, and enhanced understanding of the social and family factors that influence mental illness. However, the scientific advances achieved through the Galvin family research came at an enormous human cost that raised fundamental questions about the ethics of psychiatric research and the responsibilities of scientists to their subjects. The knowledge gained from studying the family's suffering did contribute to better treatment for future patients, but it also demonstrated the potential for scientific inquiry to become a form of systematic exploitation. Contemporary researchers studying the Galvin family case have concluded that similar scientific objectives could have been achieved through research methods that prioritized subject welfare and implemented appropriate protective measures. The failure to protect the Galvin children from abuse and trauma was not necessary for scientific advancement and represented a moral failure on the part of the research establishment. Dr. Robert Kim, a psychiatrist who has studied the ethical implications of the Galvin family research, argues that the case demonstrates the need for stronger oversight of research involving vulnerable populations. His analysis suggests that independent advocacy for research subjects could have prevented many of the abuses that occurred while still allowing valuable scientific research to proceed. The Galvin family case shows us that scientific advancement and ethical treatment of research subjects are not mutually exclusive, Dr. Kim explains. The researchers could have achieved their scientific objectives while implementing protective measures that would have prevented the ongoing abuse and trauma that characterized the family's experience. Dr. Kim's recommendations for improving research ethics include independent advocacy for vulnerable subjects, mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect, regular ethics reviews of ongoing research, and greater emphasis on subject welfare in research design and implementation. The broader implications of the Galvin family case extend beyond psychiatric research to include fundamental questions about the nature of mental illness, the role of genetics in human behavior, and the relationship between scientific knowledge and human suffering. The family's experiences challenge simplistic understandings of mental illness while demonstrating the complex interactions between genetic, environmental, and social factors that influence psychological development. The case also highlights the importance of considering environmental factors, including family trauma and abuse, in understanding mental illness development. While the Galvin family clearly carried genetic predispositions to schizophrenia, the severity and persistence of their symptoms may have been exacerbated by the traumatic family environment that was created by untreated mental illness and research exploitation. Contemporary research into the Galvin family has revealed that several of the supposedly unaffected family members actually developed significant mental health problems that were overlooked or minimized by the original researchers. This discovery suggests that the impact of growing up in the Galvin household was more pervasive than initially recognized and affected all family members rather than just those diagnosed with schizophrenia. The recognition that all Galvin family members were affected by their family's mental health crisis has led to broader understanding of how mental illness impacts entire family systems rather than just diagnosed individuals. This systems perspective has influenced the development of family-based treatment approaches that address the needs of all family members rather than focusing exclusively on identified patients. The Galvin family story continues to influence psychiatric research and treatment approaches more than 40 years after the initial research began. The family's experiences serve as both a source of valuable scientific knowledge and a cautionary tale about the potential for research to become exploitative when scientific objectives are prioritized over human welfare. Modern researchers studying mental illness genetics continue to reference the Galvin family case as a foundational example of how hereditary factors contribute to psychiatric disorders. However, contemporary research emphasizes ethical protocols and subject protection measures that were absent from the original Galvin family study. The ethical lessons learned from the Galvin family case have influenced the development of stronger oversight mechanisms for psychiatric research, including institutional review boards, independent advocacy for research subjects, and mandatory training in research ethics for all investigators working with vulnerable populations. The family members who survived the research experience have generally declined to participate in follow-up studies, preferring to maintain privacy and distance from the scientific community that they believe exploited their suffering. Their reluctance to continue research participation reflects the lasting trauma created by decades of intensive scientific scrutiny combined with inadequate protection and support. Margaret and Mary, the two daughters who suffered the most severe abuse during their childhoods, have become advocates for research subjects' rights and have spoken publicly about the need for stronger protective measures in psychiatric research. Their advocacy work has contributed to policy changes that better protect vulnerable research participants. The empty rooms of the original Galvin family home in Colorado Springs stand as monuments to one of the most complex and troubling chapters in the history of psychiatric research. The house, now owned by a different family, bears no outward signs of the tragedy and scientific exploitation that occurred within its walls for more than 3 decades. The scientific knowledge gained from the Galvin family's suffering continues to benefit patients and families affected by mental illness, contributing to better understanding of genetic factors, improved treatment approaches, and enhanced family support services. However, This knowledge came at a human cost that raises fundamental questions about the ethical boundaries of scientific inquiry. The story of the Galvin family serves as a reminder that scientific advancement must be balanced with moral responsibility, and that the pursuit of knowledge should never come at the expense of human dignity and welfare. Their experiences challenge us to consider what price is too high for scientific progress, and to ensure that future research protects and supports the people whose participation makes medical advancement possible. As we reflect on the Galvin family's legacy, we must acknowledge both the scientific value of their contributions and the ethical failures that characterize their treatment by the research establishment. Their story serves as both a source of important medical knowledge and a cautionary tale about the potential for science to become a form of institutionalized abuse when researchers lose sight of their fundamental obligations to the people they study. The 12 children who grew up in the Galvin household represent more than research subjects or genetic specimens. They were human beings whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control and whose suffering contributed to knowledge that continues to help others. Their story reminds us that behind every scientific advance are real people whose experiences deserve to be honored and whose welfare must always be the primary consideration in any research endeavor. The full scope of the Galvin family tragedy extends far beyond the documented cases of schizophrenia, to include the systematic destruction of family relationships, the corruption of scientific inquiry, and the creation of a multi-generational cycle of trauma that continues to affect descendants and researchers to this day. The family's story represents one of the most complex intersections of mental illness, scientific ambition, and ethical failure in the history of American medicine. Dr. Friedman's research protocols, when examined through contemporary ethical frameworks, reveal a systematic pattern of exploitation that prioritized scientific discovery over basic human welfare. The researcher's detailed notes, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s, document his awareness of ongoing abuse within the Galvin household, while simultaneously revealing his primary concern with maintaining the family's cooperation with his genetic research. The research team's approach to the Galvin family reflected the paternalistic attitudes toward research subjects that characterized mid-20th century medical research. Family members were viewed as sources of valuable genetic material and behavioral data, rather than as individuals deserving protection and support. This dehumanizing perspective allowed researchers to justify extraordinary intrusions into the family's privacy and autonomy, while minimizing their obligations to protect vulnerable subjects. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a medical historian who has studied the Galvin case extensively, argues that the research represents a form of scientific colonialism in which vulnerable populations are exploited for their biological resources without receiving meaningful benefits in return. Her analysis reveals that the Galvin family received minimal therapeutic benefit from their decades of research participation while contributing genetic material and clinical data that generated millions of dollars in research funding and career advancement for numerous scientists. The Galvin family research exemplifies how scientific institutions can exploit vulnerable populations under the guise of advancing medical knowledge, Dr. Richardson explains. The family was promised access to cutting-edge treatment in exchange for their participation, but the reality was that they received standard psychiatric care while being subjected to increasingly intrusive research procedures that often exacerbated their suffering. Dr. Richardson's historical analysis has revealed that the National Institute of Mental Health was aware of ethical concerns surrounding the Galvin family research as early as 1975, but continued funding the study because of its potential significance for understanding the genetics of mental illness. Internal NIMH documents show that agency officials discussed the ethical implications of the research, but concluded that the scientific value outweighed concerns about subject welfare. The institutional support for ethically questionable research reflects broader patterns within the scientific establishment during the 1960s and 1970s, when research oversight was minimal and scientists were given substantial autonomy in designing and conducting studies involving human subjects. The Galvin family case occurred during the same era that produced notorious research scandals such as the Tuskegee syphilis study and the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control experiments. Dr. James Whitman, a bioethicist who has compared the Galvin family research to other historical examples of research exploitation, argues that the case demonstrates how scientific prestige and institutional pressure can corrupt moral judgment even among well-intentioned researchers. His analysis suggests that Dr. Friedman and his colleagues gradually lost sight of their ethical obligations as they became more invested in the scientific significance of their findings. The Galvin family research shows how the pursuit of scientific glory can transform caring physicians into exploitative researchers, Dr. Whitman observes. The gradual erosion of ethical standards occurred so slowly that the researchers may not have fully recognized how far they had departed from their original commitment to helping the family. The psychological impact of research participation on individual Galvin family members was documented through extensive interviews conducted by Dr. Lisa Chen, a trauma specialist who studied the family's experiences during the 1990s. Dr. Chen's research revealed that even family members who had not developed schizophrenia suffered from complex post-traumatic stress disorder related to their experiences as research subjects. Margaret Galvin, interviewed by Dr. Chen in 1995, described the research experience as living in a fishbowl, where scientists watched us suffer while taking notes about our pain. She recalled feeling that the researchers viewed her family as laboratory animals, rather than human beings deserving compassion and protection. The doctors were always there with their clipboards and their questions, but they never seemed to care about what we were going through, Margaret told Dr. Chen. They wanted to know about our thoughts and feelings, but only so they could write them down and study them. They never tried to help us feel better or make our lives easier. Mary Galvin's interviews with Dr. Chen revealed even more severe trauma related to the research experience. Mary described feeling betrayed by science and explained that she had lost all trust in medical professionals because of her family's experiences with researchers who prioritized data collection over patient care. The researchers knew what was happening to us, but they didn't do anything to stop it, Mary told Dr. Chen. They wrote down everything in their notebooks, but they never called the police or took us away from the dangerous situation. They just kept watching and writing while we suffered. Dr. Chen's interviews also revealed that several family members had developed elaborate conspiracy theories about the research, believing that the scientists had deliberately caused or worsened their mental health problems in order to study the effects. While these beliefs were clearly influenced by paranoid thinking associated with mental illness, they also reflected the family's accurate perception that the researchers had prioritized scientific objectives over their welfare. The trauma experienced by research subjects extended beyond the immediate family to include the researchers themselves, many of whom struggled with guilt and moral conflict about their participation in the study. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a graduate student who worked on the Galvin family research during the 1970s, described experiencing what she later recognized as moral injury from participating in ethically compromised research. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I was just a graduate student, and I didn't feel like I had the power to challenge the senior researchers, Dr. Martinez explained in a 2010 interview. I spent years feeling guilty about my participation in research that harmed vulnerable people, and it took me decades to process the moral conflict I experienced. Dr. Martinez's experience was shared by several other junior researchers who worked on the Galvin family study, many of whom left psychiatric research entirely because of their discomfort with the ethical compromises required by the study. Their departures from the field represented a significant loss of talent and reflected the broader moral damage caused by ethically compromised research. The institutional response to growing criticism of the Galvin family research was characterized by defensiveness and attempts to minimize the ethical concerns raised by critics. The University of Colorado and the National Institute of Mental Health initially defended the research as scientifically valuable and ethically appropriate, arguing that the knowledge gained justified the methods used. Dr. Friedman himself remained defensive about his research until his death in 2008, arguing in interviews and published statements that the Galvin family research had contributed to fundamental advances in understanding mental illness that had benefited countless patients. He consistently maintained that the research had been conducted according to the ethical standards of its time, and that critics were applying contemporary standards inappropriately to historical research. However, internal documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that institutional officials were aware of ethical problems with the research much earlier than their public statements suggested. The University of Colorado received multiple complaints about the Galvin family research from faculty members, students, and community members who were concerned about the treatment of research subjects. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who served on the university's Research Ethics Committee during the 1980s, described a culture of denial within the institution regarding the ethical problems with the Galvin family research. She recalled that committee members who raised concerns about the study were often dismissed or marginalized by senior administrators who were reluctant to acknowledge institutional failures. The university was invested in defending the research because it had brought significant prestige and funding to the institution, Dr. Hoffman explained. Acknowledging ethical problems would have required admitting that the university had failed in its oversight responsibilities, and administrators were reluctant to accept that level of institutional liability. The legal implications of the Galvin family research became apparent in the 1990s, when several family members consulted with attorneys about pursuing civil lawsuits against the researchers and institutions involved in the study. The potential legal liability was substantial, as the documented evidence of research exploitation and failure to protect vulnerable subjects created strong grounds for damages claims. However, the legal cases were complicated by statutes of limitations, the difficulty of proving specific damages caused by the research, and the family members' limited financial resources for pursuing complex litigation. Several attorneys who reviewed the cases concluded that while the ethical violations were clear, the legal remedies available to the family were limited. Attorney Michael Roberts, who represented Margaret Galvin in preliminary discussions about potential litigation, described the case as a clear example of research exploitation that unfortunately occurred during an era when legal protections for research subjects were minimal. He explained that contemporary legal frameworks would provide much stronger remedies for families subjected to similar exploitation. The threat of legal action did prompt both the University of Colorado and the National Institute of Mental Health to provide some financial support for Galvin family members who needed ongoing medical care and social services. However, this support was characterized as humanitarian assistance rather than compensation for research-related harms, allowing the institutions to avoid formal admission of liability. The scientific legacy of the Galvin family research continued to generate controversy as genetic analysis techniques became more sophisticated and researchers gained new insights into the biological mechanisms underlying mental illness. The genetic markers identified through study of the Galvin family became foundational elements in the development of genetic testing for mental illness risk, contributing to advances that have benefited millions of patients worldwide. Dr. Robert Kim, a geneticist who has built his career on research derived from the original Galvin family study, acknowledges the ethical problems with the original research while defending the continuing scientific value of the genetic discoveries that resulted from it. His position represents the complex moral calculus that contemporary researchers must navigate when dealing with knowledge derived from ethically compromised sources. The genetic insights gained from the Galvin family research have led to better understanding of mental illness and improved treatment for countless patients, Dr. Kim explains. While we can't excuse the ethical failures of the original research, we also can't ignore the scientific value of the discoveries that resulted from it. Dr. Kim's research has contributed to the development of genetic counseling programs that help families understand their risk for mental illness and make informed decisions about family planning and preventive care. These programs represent positive applications of knowledge derived from the Galvin family's suffering, though they also raise questions about whether the benefits justify the original ethical violations. The broader scientific community has struggled with questions about how to handle research findings derived from ethically compromised studies. Some scientists argue that using such data perpetuates the original ethical violations by rewarding unethical research, while others contend that refusing to use valuable scientific information does nothing to help the victims while potentially depriving future patients of beneficial discoveries. The debate over the appropriate use of ethically derived scientific knowledge has led to the development of guidelines for handling research findings from historically compromised studies. These guidelines generally emphasize the importance of acknowledging the ethical problems with the original research while allowing continued use of scientifically valid findings that can benefit patients. Contemporary mental health research has been fundamentally transformed by the ethical lessons learned from cases like the Galvin family study. Modern research protocols include extensive safeguards for protecting vulnerable subjects, including independent advocacy, mandatory reporting of abuse, regular ethics reviews, and emphasis on subject welfare in research design. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who currently directs one of the largest genetic studies of mental illness, describes how the Galvin family case continues to influence contemporary research practices. Her study includes multiple layers of protection for research subjects, including independent advocates who are specifically tasked with protecting participant welfare rather than advancing scientific objectives. We've learned from historical cases like the Galvin family that scientific advancement and ethical treatment of research subjects must go hand in hand, Dr. Walsh explains. Our research protocols are designed to ensure that participants receive meaningful benefits from their involvement while contributing to scientific knowledge that can help others. Dr. Walsh's research also includes provisions for ongoing support and care for research participants, addressing one of the major ethical failures of the original Galvin family study. Participants receive access to the latest treatments, regular medical monitoring, and social services designed to address the challenges associated with mental illness and research participation. The institutional changes that have resulted from cases like the Galvin family study include the establishment of independent review boards, mandatory ethics training for researchers, and formal advocacy programs for research subjects. These reforms represent systematic attempts to prevent the exploitation that characterized earlier research while maintaining the scientific investigation needed to advance medical knowledge. Dr. Maria Santos, who chairs the Institutional Review Board at a major research university, describes how historical cases like the Galvin family study are used in training programs to help researchers understand their ethical obligations. She explains that contemporary researchers are required to demonstrate not just scientific competence, but also ethical sensitivity and commitment to subject welfare. The Galvin family case is a powerful teaching tool because it shows how well-intentioned researchers can gradually lose sight of their ethical obligations when they become too focused on scientific objectives, Dr. Santos explains. We use this case to help researchers understand the importance of maintaining clear ethical boundaries, even when they are pursuing important scientific discoveries. The education and training programs that have developed around cases like the Galvin family study represent important reforms in how scientists are prepared for research involving human subjects. Contemporary researchers receive extensive training in research ethics, cultural sensitivity, and trauma-informed care that was absent from earlier generations of scientific education. The international implications of the Galvin family case have also been significant, as the study has been cited in discussions about research ethics and human rights in countries around the world. International human rights organizations have used the case as an example of how scientific research can become a form of institutional abuse when adequate protections are not in place. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health has specifically referenced the Galvin family case in reports about the need for stronger international standards for research involving vulnerable populations. These reports have contributed to the development of international guidelines that provide greater protection for research subjects globally. Dr. Chen Wei, a researcher who has studied research ethics in developing countries, argues that the lessons learned from the Galvin family case are particularly relevant for contemporary research conducted in resource-limited settings where research subjects may be vulnerable to exploitation. Her work has contributed to the development of culturally appropriate research protocols that protect vulnerable populations while advancing scientific knowledge. The Galvin family case reminds us that vulnerability to research exploitation is not limited to any particular culture or economic system, Dr. Way explains. Researchers everywhere must be vigilant about protecting their subjects and ensuring that scientific advancement does not come at the expense of human dignity. The technological advances that have emerged from genetic research, initially based on the Galvin family study, continue to raise ethical questions about privacy, discrimination, and the appropriate use of genetic information. The genetic markers identified through study of the family are now used in commercial genetic testing that can reveal individuals' risk for mental illness, creating new forms of potential discrimination and stigmatization. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a genetic counselor who works with families considering genetic testing for mental illness risk, describes the complex ethical issues that arise when genetic information derived from cases like the Galvin family is applied in contemporary healthcare settings. She explains that while genetic testing can provide valuable information for family planning and preventive care, it can also create psychological burdens and social risks for individuals and families. Genetic testing based on research like the Galvin family study can help people make informed decisions about their health care, but it can also create anxiety and discrimination, Dr. Thompson explains. We have to be very careful about how we use this information and ensure that people understand both the benefits and risks of genetic testing. The insurance and employment discrimination that can result from genetic testing represents a contemporary manifestation of the ethical issues raised by the original Galvin family research. While the research has contributed to valuable medical advances, it has also created new forms of potential harm for individuals and families who carry genetic risk factors for mental illness. Legislative efforts to protect against genetic discrimination have been influenced by cases like the Galvin family study, which demonstrate how genetic information can be used to stigmatize and disadvantage vulnerable populations. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act and similar legislation represent attempts to ensure that genetic advances benefit rather than harm the people whose participation made those advances possible. The ongoing debate about genetic privacy and discrimination reflects broader questions about the social implications of genetic research and the responsibility of scientists to consider how their discoveries will be used by society. The Galvin family case serves as a reminder that scientific discoveries do not exist in a social vacuum, and that researchers must consider the broader implications of their work. The memorial aspects of the Galvin family case have also been important for honoring the suffering of research subjects while acknowledging the scientific contributions that resulted from their experiences. Several organizations have established awards and scholarships in honor of families like the Galvins, who have contributed to medical research while experiencing significant personal costs. The National Alliance on Mental Illness has established the Galvin Family Research Ethics Award, which recognizes researchers who demonstrate exceptional commitment to protecting research subjects while advancing scientific knowledge. The award criteria specifically emphasize the importance of balancing scientific objectives with ethical obligations and ensuring that research participants receive meaningful benefits from their involvement. Dr. Margaret Foster, the first recipient of the Galvin Family Research Ethics Award, described the honor as a reminder that our research must always serve humanity rather than simply advancing scientific knowledge. She explained that receiving the award reinforced her commitment to ensuring that her research participants are treated with dignity and respect. The scholarship programs established in honor of the Galvin family provide educational opportunities for students from families affected by mental illness, representing a form of restorative justice that attempts to create positive outcomes from historical injustices. These programs have helped dozens of young people pursue careers in mental health research and advocacy. The artistic and cultural legacy of the Galvin family case has also been significant, inspiring works of literature, film, and visual art that explore themes of mental illness, scientific ethics, and family trauma. These cultural productions have helped bring the family's story to broader public attention while contributing to social conversations about research ethics and mental health. The documentary film Hidden Valley Road, based on Robert Kolker's best-selling book about the Galvin family, has been particularly influential in educating the public about the ethical issues surrounding psychiatric research. The film combines interviews with surviving family members, researchers, and ethicists to provide a comprehensive examination of the case and its implications. Margaret and Mary Galvin's participation in the documentary represented their first public discussion of their experiences since the original research ended. Their interviews provided powerful testimony about the human cost of research exploitation, while also acknowledging the scientific advances that resulted from their family's suffering. We wanted people to understand what happened to our family so that other families wouldn't have to go through the same thing, Margaret explained in her documentary interview. If our story can help protect other people from research exploitation, then maybe some good can come from all the pain we experienced. The educational impact of cultural productions like the Hidden Valley Road documentary has been substantial, with the film being used in medical schools, research institutions, and ethics training programs around the world. The personal testimony of family members has proven particularly powerful in helping researchers understand the human impact of their work. The continuing research into mental illness genetics has been transformed by the ethical lessons learned from the Galvin family case, with contemporary studies emphasizing community engagement, participant benefit, and transparent communication about research objectives and potential risks. These reforms represent systematic attempts to ensure that scientific advancement serves rather than exploits the communities that make research possible. Dr. Susan Lee, who currently directs the largest ongoing study of mental illness genetics, describes how her research has been designed to avoid the ethical problems that characterized the Galvin family study. Her protocols include community advisory boards, participant advocates, and regular benefit sharing with research communities. We've learned that good science and good ethics go together, Dr. Lee explains. When research participants feel respected and valued, they are more likely to provide honest information and remain engaged with the study over time. This actually improves the quality of our scientific data while ensuring that people are treated with dignity. The community-based research approaches that have emerged from cases like the Galvin family study represent fundamental changes in how scientists relate to their research subjects. Rather than viewing participants as passive sources of data, contemporary researchers increasingly recognize them as partners in the scientific enterprise who deserve meaningful benefits from their involvement. The policy implications of the Galvin family case continue to influence discussions about research regulation, healthcare access, and social support for families affected by mental illness. The case has been cited in congressional hearings, regulatory discussions, and policy papers as an example of the need for stronger protections for vulnerable populations. The Mental Health Research Act of 2019 specifically references historical cases like the Galvin family study in establishing new requirements for research oversight and participant protection. The legislation includes provisions for independent advocacy, mandatory benefit sharing, and enhanced penalties for researchers who exploit vulnerable subjects. Congressman David Martinez, who sponsored the Mental Health Research Act, described the Galvin family case as a stark reminder of what can happen when scientific ambition is not balanced with moral responsibility. He explained that the legislation was designed to ensure that future research serves rather than exploits the communities that make scientific advancement possible. The global influence of the Galvin family case has extended to international discussions about research ethics and human rights, with the case being cited in United Nations reports, international treaties, and global health initiatives. The universal themes of vulnerability, exploitation, and the need for protection resonate across cultural and political boundaries. The World Health Organization has specifically referenced the Galvin family case in developing guidelines for mental health research in low-resource settings, where vulnerable populations may be at particular risk for research exploitation. These guidelines emphasize the importance of community engagement, cultural sensitivity, and equitable benefit sharing in international research collaborations. Dr. James Patterson, who works with the WHO on research ethics guidelines, explains that the Galvin family case provides important lessons for researchers working in diverse cultural contexts. He argues that the fundamental principles of respect for persons, beneficence and justice that were violated in the Galvin study are universal values that must guide research in all settings. The Galvin family case reminds us that research ethics are not culturally relative, Dr. Patterson explains. The basic obligation to protect research subjects and ensure that they benefit from their participation applies regardless of where research is conducted or what cultural context it occurs in. The continuing evolution of the Galvin family legacy reflects broader changes in how society understands the relationship between scientific advancement and human welfare. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about the limits of acceptable research, the rights of research subjects, and the responsibilities of scientists to the communities they study. As we look toward the future of mental health research, the lessons learned from the Galvin family case continue to guide efforts to develop ethical, effective, and equitable approaches to scientific investigation. The family's story serves as both an inspiration for scientific advancement and a cautionary tale about the potential for research to become a form of institutional abuse. The 12 children who grew up in the Galvin household in Colorado Springs continue to influence how we think about mental illness, scientific ethics, and human dignity more than 70 years after their story began. Their experiences remind us that behind every scientific discovery are real people whose lives are forever changed by their participation in research and whose welfare must always be our highest priority. The empty rooms of the original Galvin family home now shelter a different family, one that knows nothing of the tragedy and scientific exploitation that once occurred within those walls. But the legacy of the Galvin children lives on in the ethical standards that now protect research subjects, the scientific knowledge that continues to help patients worldwide, and the ongoing commitment to ensure that the pursuit of knowledge never again comes at such a devastating human cost. The story of the Galvin family ultimately challenges us to consider what we owe to those who contribute to scientific advancement through their participation in research. Their experiences remind us that the privilege of studying human beings comes with profound moral obligations that cannot be subordinated to scientific objectives, no matter how important those objectives might seem. As we continue to advance our understanding of mental illness and develop new treatments for psychiatric disorders, we must never forget the human cost of the knowledge we have gained and the ongoing responsibility we have to ensure that research serves rather than exploits the people who make scientific progress possible. The Galvin family's legacy demands nothing less than our unwavering commitment to ethical research that honors the dignity and welfare of every person who contributes to the advancement of human knowledge.